So it looks like we're live, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Where's the Funding, hosted by the Fiber Broadband Association and sponsored by Broadband.money. I'm Gary Bolton, President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association, and this is our 9th episode of 2023. This is a 12-part series designed to help you understand, navigate, and obtain matching funds for broadband grants. The NTIA BEAD program requires grant applications to come up to the table with a minimum of 25% matching funds and a letter of credit upfront with the application. For many smaller non-traditional providers and communities, this may sound daunting, but it doesn't have to be. This 12-part series is designed to help you understand how and why meeting these requirements can be straightforward. Last month we had a great session where we discussed matching funds for rural electric co-ops and telcos with Darren Farnan, the Chief Operating Officer at United Fiber. If you missed it, you can go to the FBA website under events or go to broadband.money.io and watch the replay. Today on Where's the Funding, we'll be discussing the challenges of matching funds with Jochai Ben-Avie, the co-founder and CEO of Connect Humanity. Jochai's career has been centered at the intersection of technology and human rights. And as a leader in global policy, advocacy, and philanthropy, he is the co-founder and CEO of Connect Humanity, a nonprofit fund which provides access to capital and knowledge to underserved communities, enable them to build out their own internet infrastructure and take control of their digital futures. He's also a Truman National Security Fellow, a non-resident fellow at Atlantic Council's DFR Lab, a World Economic Forum Global Shaper, and a Code for Science and Society board member. He was previously Mozilla's head of international public policy and led the Firefox makers' open source funding arm, where he spearheaded Mozilla's work on connectivity around the world. Before Mozilla, he was the inaugural policy director at Access Now, which is under his leadership became one of the largest global digital rights organizations. Early in his career, Jochai worked in the educational policy, affordable housing, terrorism, and reconciliation as an advisor to some of the largest foundations in the world. He received his education at Bard College at Simon's Rock, where he graduated summa cum laude, and at the University of Oxford's Lincoln College. So Jochai, welcome. And for our audience, please put any questions you have in the chat as we go and work them into the questions into our discussions. So Jochai, before we jump into the challenges of matching funds, let's start with a little bit about you. You have this long history in public housing and human rights and public policy and technology. Kind of what's been the driver for your passion to help with people?
Thanks so much for having me, Gary. I've always believed that the internet is a gateway to the wide realization of different human rights and causes. So whether we care about education or we care about political participation or we care about, social development, cultural exchange, access to healthcare, all of these things are increasingly intermediated by the internet. And, those without internet access are falling further behind just by staying where they are. I mean, ultimately, a digital economy and a digital society only exists for those who are connected to it. And so both defending sort of internet policy and working to shape the sort of rules and policies and laws that govern our use of the internet, as well as expanding access to the internet itself, has been, the driving force of my career.
I always thought it was ironic is during the pandemic, the people who needed the PPP and the subsidies the most weren't connected. Mm-hmm. And, it was a race to apply for your PPP online. That just seemed crazy. And that's the way the world's going to be going forward, right?
Absolutely. And I think, if you look even, further down this sort of spectrum in terms of need, we saw a lot of folks who lived in affordable housing. You mentioned earlier in my career, I worked in affordable housing at the Beacon communities. A lot of housing authorities started to move their paperwork, their rental assistance programs, Section 8, rent certification, things like that, online, and increasingly online only, which means that folks who don't have internet access, who are already, low-income families living in affordable housing, might lose their homes because they aren't able to submit their paperwork through these online portals. And so the consequences of being unconnected have never been so grave.
You know, I just we were just talking. I bought a new house, and I had the only thing available was Comcast, and
Mhm.
even to try to subscribe to broadband, there's no phone number. You have to go online, and then you
Mhm.
might get a chat bot. But I mean, it's you just can't not. There's not a person to call or
No.
you know. So tell us a little about Connect Humanity. You know, how'd that come about? You know, how'd you guys decide that you need to stand up this fund?
Yeah, so I was at the time as you mentioned, the head of international public policy at Mozilla and spearheading a lot of work on connectivity. And probably why the man who went on to become my co-founder, Chris Werman, called a group of us from leaders in tech and philanthropy and nonprofit land together to sort of talk about what does building back better even mean? You know, what are the needs the pandemic has exposed, like we've just been talking about? And, you had folks who were talking about kids who were losing a year or more of education. You had folks who were talking about, people who were falling into poverty and struggling to provide for their families, or who couldn't talk to a doctor or get, make a vaccine appointment or get actual information about COVID. And as everybody said, y'all may come from different walks and causes, but you're all talking about connectivity here. And, looking out at the world and seeing half of humanity lacks reliable, affordable access to the internet, including 1 in 3 Americans who don't use the internet fast enough at speeds fast enough to use Zoom. There's just this overwhelming feeling that it doesn't have to be this way. What I find in some ways most frustrating and most inspiring about working in this area is we generally know how to connect the unconnected. That's not the hard part. Um, and we know that neither the largest, traditional telecom operators, the market, for lack of a better word, nor government alone, have not and will not connect everyone. It's just not in the business models to do so. And so at Connect Humanity, we focus on community-focused ISPs, folks who are more community-oriented, often community-owned. But if we look at sort of the US market of about 2,800 licensed ISPs, 60% of the market serves fewer than 500 census blocks. And it's really, what we see both in the United States and around the world, these small and medium ISPs are providing some of the fastest speeds at the lowest prices, which is not surprising, right? You would imagine that folks, like small businesses in any sector who are grounded in the community, are committed to providing great service in that community, who have faster response times because they live in the community. But nearly universally, those folks struggle with access to capital. And for me, that has always been the hard part of digital equity for all. And so we created Connect Humanity to provide low-income, rural, and communities of color with the access to capital and knowledge that they need in order to build their own internet infrastructure and take control of their digital futures. And so we sit sort of uniquely positioned between sort of communities in need, these community-focused ISPs, and funders and investors. And by their powers combined and providing advice and support to all three, we can really help the internet to get built, in communities in need today.
So are these, do you look mostly at established community ISPs, or do you have, just basically community champions that come to you and say, hey, we've been left behind. We have to figure out how to stand up, broadband in our community?
We do nothing without a community champion. And so, on the community side, that might be a mayor, it might be a pastor, it might be a nonprofit, it might be a tribal, leader, but someone who has community trust and sort of that local community knowledge, which is just so important to building that buy-in and really getting these kind of builds right. Sometimes they have their own ISP, and sometimes the community champion is an ISP, right? Someone from the community said, you know what, we need to go build our own internet infrastructure. You talked about electric co-ops, right? Earlier in the show. If we look at the history of rural electrification, a lot of that was from folks coming together who said, no one's going to come serve us. We got to go build our own electricity infrastructure. And with a little bit of help from the government, they started these co-ops. And the legacy of that is 1 in 8 Americans still gets their power from an electricity co-op. But, I think We look for that sort of community champion, and sometimes they are an ISP, sometimes they're already in touch with an ISP. Sometimes our work is to help, match them with an ISP who's going to meet their needs, and help them speak each other's language and sort of help to bring that partnership together. And sometimes we get approached by ISPs who say, "Hey, I want to, build into this area. That seems like the next logical choice, for my business." And we can help, support them thinking through, how do you do community engagement? How do you do the wraparound digital equity services like digital literacy, device access, and think holistically about supporting the needs in these communities.
So your profile is then largely these unserved communities, underserved communities that are really being left behind and need someone to help them find a way forward. Is that pretty much?
Yeah, again, we focus on low-income communities, rural communities, and communities of color. You don't necessarily have to fit all three, but that's generally what we're looking at as we think about where we prioritize our support, both financially and in terms of advice and strategic guidance.
So let's talk about matching funds. So how big of an issue for a community provider is matching funds?
I think it's a huge issue. I mean, again, if we look at, you look at an overlap of low income communities, and underserved communities, there's a whole lot of overlap there, both in rural, places, but also in urban centers, where you sometimes have sort of neighborhoods where you have the Swiss cheese problem, right? Where folks have built sort of around, but not into those kinds of lower income communities within the city. And in order to qualify for $1 of BEAD, you need a 25% capital match. And that, as you said in the beginning, Gary, daunting is definitely, I think, a word that we hear from a lot of folks. And I don't want to underestimate that. I mean, it is a significant challenge, and we haven't even gotten to letter of credit, which I would say is an even bigger problem. But I do think that there are ways to sort of do this. I think we've seen some guidance from NTIA that they're willing to, sort of have given guidance that the local match can be waived down to zero in high cost areas. Just because you mentioned electricity co-ops, sometimes you can, have your make ready work, or rights of way or other assets that are contributed to the project count toward local capital match. You can sometimes have labor count. Each state office is going to have their own interpretation of what's going to count. I think it's a little concerning that NTIA's guidance sort of instructs the states to give priority to those who bring more local match. And so, you run the risk of, a smaller, more community-minded ISP losing out in an area to a larger incumbent who may be able to sort of put more money on the table, but doesn't have that sort of connection to the community and community buy-in there that ultimately I think would lead to a better outcome for the residents.
So, yeah, I mean, and that's one thing, when we had United Fiber on here, just the electric co-ops are in a great position because, they already have assets, so they can be able to pledge their assets from the electric business for their broadband and vice versa, and be able to leverage employees on both sides of the fence. And so they're in a great spot to do that. So it's great to see. And, I'm in Huntsville, Alabama, and our utility put up fiber and Google lit it up. And so we were, and I wouldn't call us rural and I wouldn't call us, but we didn't have broadband. We were kind of trapped with some incumbents that had us way down on their priority list. So it kind of changed the whole landscape. Right now, I got 4 fiber providers across my front yard. So once you have fiber, everybody wants to jump in. But let's, so beyond the match, then you have this whole thing, letter of credit. So can you kind of explain the letter of credit requirements under BEAD NOFO?
Just one more point on the local match is to say, we've also had a lot of conversations with local foundations, and some local businesses who are also a potential source of match. And so I would encourage folks to think broadly about how to get, and how to get creative in terms of securing the funds for the match. Letter of credit is a much tougher problem. So in addition to the local capital match, which is again 25% of the total award, the letter of credit is 25% of the federal funding of the BEAD money. And this is an irrevocable standby letter of credit, which means that you need to go to a bank and get them to issue one of these. And it's not just any bank. You got to go to a FDIC regulated, which is a depository institution, the sort of largest banks, but not community banks or community development financial institutions or impact investors. It has to be a very specific type of bank with a Weiss rating of B- or better, which further narrows the field. And in order to issue one of these letters of credit, you generally have to provide cash or cash alternatives. But generally banks want to see cash, because the thing with a standby letter of credit is the bank's on the hook if you don't perform, right? And the government can come and sort of say, conditions were met, I'm demanding my money. And so the bank doesn't want to be liable for the ISP's underperformance. And so they want to be pretty confident they're going to require cash. Maybe if you're a very established entity, they might take some assets in the mix, but they generally want cash. And then they're going to charge you on top of that for the service that they're providing here. And you have to do all of this before the BEAD application. So, one, you're tying up a ton of capital, which you may not necessarily have. Two, you got to pay those fees and interest on that letter of credit, regardless of whether you actually get the BEAD award. And so, folks could be out, depending on the size of the project, thousands to hundreds of thousands to, potentially millions in a really big project, before they have even, applied to BEAD or found out if they got it. And with a standby letter of credit, you also have to keep that cash locked up for the duration of the project. And so it's not just being, all that working capital, 25% of, however much money you're getting in BEAD money, that is tied up for years and years that can't actually be used to, build the network. And so even taking a conservative calculation, when you combine these requirements together, for every dollar a project costs, the local community is going to be coming up with 61 cents of local capital between the local community and the ISP. And I mean, does anyone think that there's $25 billion available in the lowest income communities in the United States to meet these requirements? It's really sort of really risks the success of the entire program, these requirements.
So, I mean, when and how should a community provider prepare to address this whole letter of credit?
So I think there's a lot of conversation going on right now about the letter of credit. You may have seen we were part of a coalition of about 300 different organizations who recently wrote to NTIA about the letter of credit requirement. And it's a big tent coalition here. You've got large ISPs, you've got small ISPs, you've got bankers, you've got digital equity focused nonprofits. Everyone is pretty universally opposed to this requirement. And so this isn't the guidance from NTIA. I mean, Alan and the NTIA team could, wave their hand and update this guidance tomorrow if they want to. So partly, I think, we're hoping that NTIA will see, the light here and issue that updated guidance and, give greater clarity and flexibility. And then ultimately, these decisions are going to come down to state broadband offices. And so they're really going to be the final arbiters of these projects' fate. And so I think part of it is being in touch with, by all means, tell NTIA, that this requirement doesn't make sense and doesn't reflect the reality of how broadband is built and needs to be built in the communities most in need today. But I think it's also about talking to the state broadband office. And I think in pretty short order, because folks need to get this before the application, folks should be starting to think about, well, okay, what are my options here? How can I go about doing this?
All right. So say you go and you're able to secure your letter of credit before you put your application in, and then you put your application in, you're successful, you get your award.
Mhm.
Is there any relief? I mean, at what point can you get a irrevocable standby letter of credit? I mean, is that what happens then?
Well, so for an irrevocable standby letter of credit and versus a letter of credit, or other mechanisms that exist, irrevocable means that the bank can't change the terms, and standby means it's sort of it's a sort of payment of last resort, right? And so whereas with a letter of credit, the banking institution generally is the one cutting the check. In a standby letter of credit, it's sort of a reserve that's kept in case something goes wrong. And so the government, at a high level, we support the objectives of trying to make sure taxpayer funds are well used, to actually build broadband. But this means that folks, even if you get the award, and even if you make progress, you start actually building the network, that money is going to be tied up in that irrevocable standby letter of credit, at least until the project is finished, and often sometime after that, because they want to have some kind of period where they can sort of make sure everything's working, make sure you've built everything, and really sort of assess the awardee's performance under the grant. And so, it could be 2-3 years, even after you finish construction, that capital is still tied up.
So if we look at all the local capital, the matching funds, letter of credit, and then even potential taxes, what's the way forward for these communities?
I mean, taxes is another issue, right? Like, you add, there's a question about whether the awards are taxable. I don't know, as far as I understand, and maybe you know better, Gary, jury's still out on that one. But if it is taxable, then that's even more local capital that's required from the ISP and from the local community, which makes it this money even more expensive to take. I think that a lot of times folks are thinking about the sort of where are they going to build, where are they going to put their equipment. They're thinking about some of the digital equity questions. They're thinking about mapping community anchor institutions. Those things are all important. But, I would say if you are not thinking about the financing and capitalization side, you're really going to struggle and be in a problem in a hurry, come next year when these application windows open up. And, I think we're also hearing from banks that there's not a ton of appetite to issue these irrevocable standby letters of credit. And so, and again, there's a limited number of banks that can issue them to begin with. And so, I would get on this problem early if you think you're going to be looking at applying to BEAD money to start exploring this.
So Connect Humanity, you guys do, a whole mix of grants and loans. What are some of the creative ways that you can, help these communities put together a capital stack that allows them to get by some of these hurdles? And you come from a housing background. You can talk a little bit about maybe the Community Reinvestment Act and how that might be leveraged.
Affordable housing doesn't work without blended finance, and I don't think connecting the unconnected will. This is not a problem that the market alone on just a straight commercial basis is going to solve. And so essential to Connect Humanity's model is sort of building these blended capital stacks. So, on a housing deal, you might have tax credits, you might have Section 8 subsidies from HUD, you might have some equity from the developer, you might have soft debt from a housing authority. There's a lot of different tools, and a lot of it is capitalization from the Community Reinvestment Act, which was passed in the 70s in the wake of the sort of mortgage redlining crisis, and obligates big banks in the United States to spend about $200 billion a year on investing in low-income communities. And so, especially for folks who are not going to be BEAD eligible, we see CRA as a very powerful tool to providing the capital and the financial resources that communities, underconnected communities need to get connected. And I think it's about sort of how do you layer these things together. So, we did a deal I know you're in Alabama, we did a deal in Macon County recently in Alabama where, we were joined by, I think, 5 other capital partners. And without any one of them, I think the whole deal would have fallen apart. But, coming together and building the stack that sort of meets everyone's needs. And this is part of what Connect Humanity does, is to sort of sit between the community. In that case, our community champion was the MECEDA, the Macon County Economic Development Authority, working with the ISP, Point Broadband, and working with that sort of range of capital partners, including Rural LISC. We were able to get that deal done and get those folks connected to fiber. And so I think that's really essential. I think part of what we're doing is also on the advice side, working with communities to sort of think about, how can we get creative? Thinking about, I think so much of, especially philanthropy, is sort of needs or gap space. Like we talk about the shortcomings in communities or what they don't have. And we really take an asset-based approach to our support, where we work with our community partners to see what kind of assets do they have. So we were doing a deal in North Carolina. And, this community has been, there are some service providers, but, generally struggling to provide 25.3 broadband speeds. And basically everyone's priced out. Average internet was like $90, $95 a month. And, this ISP came and they said, hey, we really want to, there was a gentleman from the community who wanted to connect his neighbors. And at the time, the library was also sort of in the same building as town hall. And at the time, there wasn't really internet access, for free in the library. And they said, hey, if you let us put an antenna on your roof, which basically costs the city nothing, we will provide internet in the library and to your offices. But, that's a vertical asset, right? And then when they wanted to expand, they said, hey, can we use that water tower you have on the other side of town to sort of extend the network? And again, that's another asset that belonged to that community that they hadn't necessarily seen as an asset, but by thinking about it in that way, really helped to get that network built and those folks connected.
So one of the questions that came in here is, can the new market tax credits be used for a match?
For local capital match, I think so. Yeah. You're gonna have to figure out how to do the deal, but yeah, I think that would be an attractive way of meeting some of the match. Generally new market tax credit can't cover the totality of the deal. You generally, for an MTC deal, you want to bring at least 70% of the capital, if not more, before you go and talk to your sort of tax credit syndicators and so forth. But definitely could be a part of the solution for communities. Not every community that is qualified for BEAD necessarily will be qualified under the new markets tax credit. So someone would have to sort of take a look at that, but certainly would be part of the range of options I'd take a look at.
Is that something that you guys, when people come to you and say, hey, we're trying to build our capital stack, can you help us with, how to blend in, what we can find from ARPA or capital projects or, all the other things that are out there? How can we pull together this capital stack?
I don't want like a million folks asking me to go do a new market tax credit deal but generally, yes. Part of our work is talking to communities about the assets they have, about the needs that they have, and designing an investment structure that's going to meet their needs. A lot of investment and finance is capital has need. That need gets expressed in a financial product, and then you sort of go to market to communities and say, hey, do you want to buy my product? And if you fit into my box, great. And if you don't, go forth and have a nice life. And I think that's backwards. We really start with the needs of the community, and then let that sort of determine the investment structure. And then we go out and sort of bring together the right blend of investors and funders that will help to make that deal successful for everyone.
So if I was to summarize, if there's community will, the community says, hey, we've been left behind, we need to do something, take matters in our own hands, stand up a broadband network for our community to make sure everyone in our community is connected. If they come to you and say, we have this community will, we got to make this happen, you guys can kind of figure out a creative way to get this thing financed.
Yeah, generally. That's the goal.
Right.
And I would say also ISPs, right? And say, I would say it's not, I mean, we often start on the community side, but, we also get a ton of inbound from, community focused ISPs who are looking to meet the needs of, in low income communities, who want to grow. And, we also, sometimes the story starts with an ISP approaching us.
Well, I mean, certainly we've seen a lot of recent success stories with public-private partnerships, and because I've never met a mayor that says I want to be in the broadband business, but every mayor I'm saying I'm in the job creation business.
Absolutely,
and whatever it takes to be able to get economic development and jobs and be able to really lift up their community. Yeah. Well, Jochai, I really appreciate you sharing your insights on the challenges of matching funds and the work that you and your team at Connect Humanity are doing to really close our nation's digital equity gap. So thank you for that. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today and look forward to getting back together next month for our next episode of Where's the Funding? You're not going to want to miss that. We'll see you guys in October. Thanks, everyone.